Hey guys, subscribe if you're a true history lover and don't want to miss any of our fascinating history content. Also comment from where and which time you are watching this video. Let's dive into an interesting medieval topic tonight. In the medieval world, belief and reality blended so completely that myths were not treated as stories, but as facts shaping everyday life, law, medicine, religion, and even survival itself. People lived in an age where books were rare, literacy was limited, and information travelled slowly, often distorted by fear, faith, and imagination. Natural events were rarely explained through science. Instead, they were understood through symbols, omens, and divine intention. Many believed the universe was a carefully ordered moral system, where every disaster had a spiritual cause and every illness was a punishment, warning, or test. Diseases were thought to be spread not by germs but by bad air, evil spirits, or the alignment of planets. And so people carried flowers, burned incense, or fled cities in panic, convinced that smell itself carried death. Comets in the sky were seen as promises of war or famine, while eclipses were feared as moments when dark forces temporarily defeated the sun or moon. Animals, too, were wrapped in myth. Cats were suspected of witchcraft, wolves were believed to be possessed by demons, and harmless creatures were killed out of fear of supernatural influence. Many sincerely believed that mythical beasts roamed distant lands, not as fantasy, but as geography, and maps were drawn with monsters at their edges to warn travellers of real danger. Medical knowledge was deeply entangled with superstition, leading people to believe that bloodletting could cure almost anything, that illness could be transferred into animals or objects, or that prayer alone could heal broken bones. Amulets made of bone, metal, or scripture were worn for protection, while charms and spoken formulas were believed to physically alter reality. Even newborn children were surrounded by ritual, as parents feared that unseen spirits might steal or curse infants if proper protections were not observed. Death itself was not considered a final end, but a transition constantly watched by angels and demons competing for souls, making everyday life feel like a spiritual battlefield. Justice systems were equally shaped by myth, as people believed divine forces would reveal guilt or innocence through ordeals involving fire, water, or combat, trusting that truth could not escape supernatural judgment. Weather was thought to be controlled by unseen forces, leading communities to accuse individuals of causing storms or crop failure through secret pacts with evil powers. This fear fed cycles of accusation and violence, where rumor alone could destroy lives. Time was also misunderstood. Many believed the end of the world was near, interpreting political unrest or natural disasters as signs of an approaching apocalypse. History itself was seen not as human progress, but as a slow decay from a lost golden age, making people suspicious of new ideas and inventions. Education reinforced many of these myths, as texts were copied repeatedly, with errors and exaggerations, transforming speculation into certainty over generations. Travellers' tales were accepted as truth, no matter how improbable, because few could verify them. The human body was believed to be governed by invisible fluids, whose imbalance explained personality, intelligence, and morality, encouraging people to treat emotional states as physical diseases. Dreams were not dismissed as imagination, but treated as messages from higher powers, warnings that could determine major life decisions. Even love and attraction were explained through magic, with spells, potions, and rituals believed to influence another person's heart against their will. Darkness itself carried meaning, as night was thought to be more than the absence of light, but a time when evil gained strength and boundaries between worlds weakened. Everyday objects could be sacred or cursed depending on context, and coincidence was rarely seen as random. These beliefs persisted for centuries because they offered certainty in a dangerous world, giving people explanations when knowledge was limited and life was fragile. While modern readers may find these myths strange or irrational, for medieval people they were logical, comforting, and deeply woven into survival itself, shaping how they understood suffering, hope, and their place in a universe they believed was alive with unseen forces watching their every move. It's how people understood morality, fate, and human worth, creating a worldview where nothing happened by chance. A person's success or failure was rarely attributed to effort alone. Instead, it was believed to be written in the stars at birth, sealed by divine will, or manipulated by hidden forces. Astrology was taken so seriously that rulers delayed battles, marriages, and coronations until favorable planetary alignments appeared, convinced that ignoring celestial advice would invite catastrophe. A child born under the wrong stars was thought to be naturally weak, cursed, or destined for tragedy, shaping how they were treated for the rest of their life. Physical deformities were often interpreted as visible signs of inner corruption or parental sin, rather than natural conditions, leading to fear and exclusion rather than care. Mental illness was rarely understood as medical. Instead, it was blamed on demonic possession, witchcraft, or moral failure, and treatments often involved exorcism, isolation, or punishment rather than compassion. People believed spoken words had real power, capable of blessing crops or destroying them, which is why oaths, curses, and prayers were treated with extreme seriousness. Breaking a vow was not just dishonest, but dangerous, believed to invite divine retribution upon entire families or communities. Even written words were feared, as many believed symbols themselves carried mystical force, making books objects of both reverence and suspicion. Fire was considered purifying beyond its physical nature, leading to the belief that burning objects or even people could cleanse spiritual corruption. This thinking justified brutal practices, as pain was believed to drive evil out of the body. Myths about purity extended to food and drink, with certain animals considered sinful to eat, and others believed to grant strength, courage, or fertility. Fasting was thought not only to cleanse the soul, but to physically weaken evil influences inside the body. The natural world was read like a coded message from God, where unusual animal behavior or malformed plants were seen as warnings of future disaster. Floods, droughts, and earthquakes were rarely understood as natural cycles. Instead, they were interpreted as punishments sent to correct moral decay. Communities responded with public repentance, self-gen punishment, or the targeting of supposed sinners rather than structural change. Foreign cultures were often imagined through myth rather than reality, filled with half-jan human creatures or strange customs exaggerated into monstrous stereotypes. This fueled fear of outsiders and reinforced the idea that the familiar world was safe while the unknown was dangerous and cursed. Even geography itself was mythologized, with distant lands believed to contain rivers of gold, immortal beings, or gateways to hell. Death rituals were shaped by fear that the dead might return if not properly buried, leading to elaborate practices meant to keep spirits at rest. Ghosts were not considered stories for entertainment, but genuine threats capable of causing illness, madness, or misfortune. People believed the dead could influence the living, which made prayers for souls not just religious acts but protective measures. Time after death was imagined vividly, with heaven and hell described in physical detail so real that people feared them as destinations rather than abstract ideas. This fear was a powerful tool in shaping behavior, obedience, and social order. Even laughter and joy were sometimes viewed with suspicion, as excessive happiness was believed to attract envy from evil forces or signal moral weakness. Silence, humility, and suffering were often praised as virtues because they were believed to protect the soul. Over generations, these myths survived because they were taught as truth, reinforced by authority, tradition, and fear, becoming invisible rules guiding every decision. Though later centuries would challenge and dismantle many of these beliefs, their influence lingered long after, shaping culture, language, and instinct. Understanding these myths today reveals not ignorance, but humanity's deep need to explain the unknown, to find meaning in chaos, and to feel protected in a world where danger once waited in every shadow. Image ETPS believed that invisible forces constantly interfered with human affairs, meaning that misfortune was never accidental. If a cow stopped giving milk, it was not due to illness or age, but because someone had cast an evil eye. If bread failed to rise, it was assumed that malicious intent or spiritual imbalance was involved. Luck itself was treated as a tangible substance that could be stolen, shared, or destroyed, and people performed small rituals daily to protect it, often without questioning why. Numbers held mysterious power, with certain dates considered cursed and others blessed, influencing when journeys began, contracts were signed, or children were conceived. Mirrors were feared because they were believed to trap souls, especially during illness or death, leading families to cover reflective surfaces to prevent spirits from becoming lost or corrupted. Hair and nails were treated with caution, as people feared these parts of the body could be used in spells if they fell into the wrong hands. Even laughter at the wrong time was believed to invite tragedy, while crying excessively was thought to attract malevolent attention. Women in particular were surrounded by myth, with natural processes misunderstood and feared, turning normal biology into something secretive and dangerous. This fear translated into rigid social control, where deviation from expected behavior was seen as evidence of dark influence rather than individuality. Children were not considered innocent by default. Many believed they were born marked by ancestral sin and required strict discipline to prevent evil from taking root. Education, when available, often reinforced superstition, teaching students to memorize authority rather than question it. Authority itself was believed to be divinely assigned, meaning rebellion against rulers was not just political but sinful, even if the ruler was cruel. Dreams of rebellion were sometimes confessed as moral failures, showing how deeply belief controlled thought itself. Pain was often accepted as necessary, even holy, because suffering was believed to purify the soul and bring spiritual reward. This belief allowed extreme hardship to be endured with resignation, rather than resistance. Travelers carried not just supplies but prayers and charms, Convinced roads were filled with spirits that could mislead or possess the unwary. Forests were especially feared, imagined as places where the rules of the human world weakened and ancient forces still ruled. Sounds in the night were rarely dismissed as animals or wind. Instead, they were interpreted as warnings, messages, or threats requiring immediate spiritual response. Silence after sunset was often respected not for peace, but for safety, as speaking aloud was thought to attract unwanted attention. Even colour carried meaning, with certain shades believed to ward off evil, and others thought to invite it. Clothing choices could therefore be protective acts rather than fashion. Illness outbreaks reinforced existing myths rather than challenging them, as survival seemed to favour those who followed tradition, strengthening belief through coincidence. When someone recovered unexpectedly, it was credited to faith or ritual rather than chance, while death confirmed the danger of doubt. Over centuries, these beliefs hardened into cultural instinct, passed down through stories told by firesides and sermons delivered with absolute certainty. Questioning them was rare and dangerous, as doubt itself was considered a moral weakness or spiritual risk. Yet within these myths was a form of logic shaped by fear, limited knowledge, and the need for control in an unpredictable world. They offered explanations when none were available, and comfort when answers were impossible. Though modern science has stripped away many of these beliefs, their echoes remain in language, tradition, and instinctive fears that still surface today. Studying medieval myths is not merely an exploration of false ideas, but a mirror reflecting how deeply humans crave meaning, protection, and certainty. When faced with darkness, they do not yet understand. Past. Medieval myths did not weaken with repetition, but instead grew stronger, becoming deeply embedded in collective memory and identity. Stories told by elders were rarely questioned, because age itself was seen as proof of truth, and tradition carried more authority than observation. When a belief survived long enough, it transformed into an unquestionable law of reality. People believed that certain families carried inherited curses, meaning misfortune was expected and almost accepted rather than challenged. Generations grew up assuming tragedy was inevitable for some and prosperity divinely reserved for others. This mindset discouraged social mobility and innovation, as attempting to escape one's assigned fate was believed to provoke disaster. Silence around taboo topics strengthened myths further, allowing imagination to fill gaps with fear. Sexuality, death, and disease were surrounded by secrecy, causing misinformation to spread unchecked. People believed that sins could physically stain the soul, leaving invisible marks that demons could recognize, which encouraged constant self-gen surveillance and guilt. Confession was not only spiritual but defensive, a way to remove dangerous spiritual residue before it attracted punishment. Community life operated on shared fear, where collective belief mattered more than individual doubt, and social harmony depended on obeying unseen rules. Festivals and rituals were carefully timed and performed, not merely for celebration, but to maintain balance between the human and supernatural worlds. Any mistake during these rituals was feared to invite calamity. Sound itself was believed to influence reality, with bells rung to drive away storms, spirits, and disease, and silence observed during moments thought to be spiritually vulnerable. Shadows were not seen as harmless effects of light, but as signs of hidden presence, leading people to fear being alone after dark. Even time was mythologized, with certain hours believed to belong to evil forces, making nighttime travel a terrifying necessity. rather than a routine activity. The human imagination filled darkness with meaning, because darkness was uncontrollable and knowledge was limited. Fear of judgment extended beyond death. As people believed ancestors watched and evaluated the living, reinforcing obedience long after authority figures were gone. The idea that thoughts themselves could be sinful created inner conflict, making people afraid of their own minds. Hope was carefully rationed, as excessive optimism was believed to provoke divine jealousy or moral downfall. Suffering, on the other hand, was romanticized as proof of virtue, encouraging endurance rather than resistance. Over time, these beliefs shaped emotional behavior, teaching people what to feel and when to feel it. Love was restrained, grief ritualized, and joy measured. Even kindness was sometimes transactional, performed to gain spiritual protection rather than compassion alone. When change finally came through science and education, many myths did not disappear, but adapted, disguising themselves in language, habit, and instinct. The medieval mind may seem distant, but its fears echo in modern superstitions, anxieties, and rituals that survive despite knowledge. These myths endured not because people were foolish, but because they offered structure in a fragile world where survival was uncertain and explanation scarce. In understanding them, we uncover not darkness alone, but humanity's enduring struggle to make sense of life, death, and the unseen forces we still feel, even when we no longer believe their names. Evil myths shaped how people understood themselves as individuals, limiting the idea of personal agency, and replacing it with submission to forces believed to be far greater than human will. People rarely asked why something happened in a practical sense. Instead, they asked what it meant spiritually. A failed harvest was not an agricultural problem to solve, but a moral message to decode. This way of thinking trained minds to search for symbolic meaning rather than physical cause, reinforcing cycles of belief with every hardship. Fear became a form of education, passed from parent to child through warnings rather than explanations. Children grew up learning what not to do far more than what to understand, internalizing invisible boundaries that governed thought and behavior. Many believed that curiosity itself was dangerous, capable of leading the soul astray, which made questioning authority or tradition feel like a personal risk. This fear preserved myths across centuries, as disbelief was equated with arrogance or spiritual blindness. Even laughter at sacred ideas could be seen as inviting disaster, turning skepticism into a silent enemy. Communities functioned like shared minds, where belief was reinforced socially and deviation invited suspicion. Once labelled strange or unlucky, a person might never escape that identity, as myth froze reputation permanently. Illness reinforced this worldview further, because recovery and death appeared unpredictable, strengthening the idea that outcomes were decided beyond human control. Medical failures did not weaken belief but intensified it, as people assumed unseen forces were resisting treatment. Survivors were seen as favored or protected, while victims were quietly blamed for hidden wrongdoing. This moralization of fate allowed people to cope emotionally, by believing suffering had purpose, even when it was cruel. Time spent in hardship was often interpreted as spiritual preparation rather than injustice. Even poverty was romanticized as humility, discouraging resistance to inequality. The belief that the world was already morally ordered made rebellion against suffering seem unnecessary or sinful. Myths also filled the silence left by limited communication. When news travelled slowly, imagination filled gaps faster than truth. Rumours became facts simply through repetition, gaining authority as they spread. Fear-based storytelling was especially powerful because it prepared people for danger, even when the danger was imaginary. Over generations, this created a culture where vigilance was constant and peace was temporary. Safety was never assumed, only maintained through obedience, ritual, and belief. The natural human need for control found expression through superstition, allowing people to feel involved in shaping outcomes through prayer, symbols, and behavior. Even when nothing changed, the act of belief itself offered comfort. As centuries passed, these myths became less about explanation and more about identity, defining who belonged, who was trusted, and who was feared. They shaped art, language, and instinct, embedding themselves so deeply that even when knowledge expanded, fear often remained. Medieval myths were not merely errors of understanding, but emotional systems designed to survive uncertainty. They taught people how to endure rather than how to change, how to obey rather than question, and how to find meaning, even in suffering. Though modern society may see these beliefs as distant, their structure survives in modern fears, anxieties, and rituals, proving that while facts evolve, the human desire for certainty in an unpredictable world remains unchanged. Belief settled permanently into medieval consciousness. It also reshaped how people remembered their own lives, turning memory into another space governed by myth. Past events were rarely recalled as they happened. They were reinterpreted through belief, reshaped to fit moral lessons and hidden meanings. A childhood illness that ended in survival became proof of divine protection, while a loss was remembered as punishment or warning rather than misfortune. Memory itself became evidence that the world followed rules, even when those rules were cruel. This selective remembering strengthened belief across generations, as stories passed down were refined to emphasize meaning rather than accuracy. Over time, personal history merged with mythic explanation, making belief feel deeply personal rather than imposed. People did not just believe myths, they remembered their lives through them. This made doubt emotionally difficult, because questioning belief felt like questioning one's own past. Even grief was shaped by this system, as mourning followed strict patterns meant to protect both the living and the dead. Excessive grief was feared, believed to disturb spirits or weaken the soul, while insufficient grief suggested moral corruption. Emotion was regulated not for health, but for safety. The correct feeling at the correct time mattered deeply. Life became a careful performance where survival depended on behaving in ways believed to keep unseen forces satisfied. Over centuries, this taught people emotional discipline, long before emotional understanding. Feelings were managed, not explored. Inner conflict was resolved through ritual rather than reflection. When fear arose, it was acted upon, not questioned. This prevented paralysis, but also prevented insight. People learned how to respond, not how to understand. Even when contradictions appeared, belief absorbed them easily, because contradiction itself was expected in a world governed by mystery. Inconsistency did not weaken belief. It confirmed that human understanding was limited. Mystery became proof of truth rather than evidence against it. This inverted logic made belief nearly indestructible. The more confusing the world became, the more necessary belief felt. Chaos demanded explanation, and belief supplied it endlessly. Over time, fear became familiar, and familiarity felt safe. People learned to live inside fear without naming it. The way one lives with cold or hunger, it was uncomfortable, but survivable. Moments of calm were enjoyed quietly, never trusted. Certainty was rare, but meaning was abundant. Meaning filled the spaces where control was impossible. Medieval myths did not promise safety. They promised explanation, and explanation, even when terrifying, was better than emptiness. To live in a world without meaning felt worse than living in a world ruled by fear. This is why belief endured even when it caused suffering. It transformed suffering into structure. It told people how to endure, how to behave, how to feel, and how to continue. In this way, medieval myths were not passive stories, but active systems, shaping perception, emotion, and memory itself. They trained generations to survive uncertainty by surrendering to invisible order, and while the symbols have changed, the impulse remains the same. Whenever humans face uncertainty too vast to control, the mind still reaches for story, pattern, and hidden cause. The medieval world shows us that myth is not the opposite of reason, but the response of the human mind when reason is not yet enough to make the world feel livable. Image https://www.grunge.com/img/gallery/what-cities-looked-like-before-electricity-was-discovered/intro-168-114,500-680.jpg image/upload/2017/10/fairy-demon-demon-2.jpg $W=548 image https://www.english-heritage.org.uk/site assets/home/learn/history/abbeys/silence/new_silence_header.jpg website version =2020 0219 Fancor Fainafocus Fake Focus Fay Focus Fay Fake and 12 Fame 12 Fame De Fay Crop Fay Quality Fay 100 Fay Scale Fay Both Fay to or Fay 1440 image https://images.theconversation.com/files/450 4237/original/file-202,000 324-21-1 egwztf.png ? Auto Fayfit Faylip Fakelib Fakelib RB-4.1.0 FAQ Fatey 45 Fatey 1000 image RTPS://www.mdpi.com/arts/art/13-00093 G011-550.jpg At the deepest and most enduring level, medieval myths reshaped how people understood reality itself, blurring the line between what was Fey experienced Fey and what was Fey assumed Fey. Reality was not something to be tested or challenged, but something to be interpreted through inherited meaning. People trusted stories more than senses, memory more than evidence, and authority more than observation. If something felt frightening, it was Fey frightening. If something felt sacred, it was Fey sacred. Emotional response became a form of truth. This meant that belief did not require proof, only consistency with what had already been accepted. Over time, The mind adapted to this structure so completely that alternative explanations felt unnatural, even threatening. The unknown was not empty. It was crowded with intention, judgment, and purpose. Nothing simply existed. It feminant, fey something. This made the world feel alive, responsive, and deeply personal, but also exhausting. People carried invisible responsibility for events beyond their control, believing their thoughts, words, or minor actions could tilt the balance between safety and disaster. Guilt became ambient, present even without wrongdoing. Fear was no longer a reaction, but a background condition, like weather, always present and occasionally violent. People learned to conserve emotional energy, avoiding extremes of feeling because extremes were believed to provoke correction. Stability was prized over happiness, predictability over possibility. Even curiosity had to justify itself by serving belief rather than challenging it. When curiosity could not be justified, it was suppressed. Not always consciously, but instinctively. This trained generations to accept limitation as wisdom. Over time, limitation became identity. People did not feel trapped by belief because they could not imagine a world without it. To imagine otherwise felt like standing on nothing. Belief gave ground underfoot. It told people where they stood in the universe, even if that place was small and fearful. In a world of famine, plague, war, and sudden death, smallness felt safer than freedom. Freedom implied responsibility, and responsibility implied blame. Myths absorbed blame and redistributed it to fate, spirits, stars, or divine will, allowing people to endure unbearable loss without collapsing into meaninglessness. Even injustice felt tolerable when it was explained. Explanation mattered more than fairness. Over centuries, this worldview hardened into instinct, shaping not only medieval life, but leaving traces in human psychology that persist today. The tendency to search for meaning in tragedy, to distrust randomness, to fear the unknown, and to cling to familiar narratives during crisis, all echo this inherited pattern. Medieval myths were not simply mistakes made by uneducated people. They were survival strategies developed under relentless pressure. They organized fear so it could be lived with, shaped chaos into story so it could be endured, and transformed suffering into something that at least made sense. In this way, medieval belief was not about ignorance, but about endurance. It allowed people to wake up, work, love, grieve, and sleep in a world that offered little security. And while modern knowledge has replaced many of their explanations, the emotional architecture remains strikingly familiar. Whenever certainty disappears, whenever danger feels uncontrollable, the human mind still reaches for myth, meaning, and invisible order. The medieval world reminds us that belief is not always about being right. It is often about being able to continue. Imagi TTPS Fei www. Jan content Fei uploads Fei 2019年11月 Fei candles Jan Petrus Fei Van Fei Shandel Fei market Fei Bei Fei candlelight Fu 731x 1024 JPG Imagi TPS Fei Medieval Torture Room Museum Fei WP 点 content Fei uploads Fei 2025年4月 Face Free Storyboard 4BC 53B9 EED UC 568B4 BCF 388E 69C2 减 74556852463 PNG Image TPS Fei WW Medieval Chronicles com 非 WP Gen Content 非 Uploads 非2015年6月非 Feudal Gen Manor Gen Estate Gen Image Gen Buildings Gen Listed Gen Feudal Gen System JPG Image ATPS Fey Books Liberties Comfy Books Fey Pictures Fey Li Joe Fey Lib Joe Temu by Essential AJPG Images ITPS Fey DT 小时 FTX DVXXVM CloudFront Net Fey Height 等于1200 Fey Quality 等于80 Ferrosize Photo 等于 Fill Fey SAC 等于 HTTPS Fey Sun A Fey RF Fey R Farsi 减 Media 减 Uploads S Sun Amazonos Com Fey RF 减 VBW VHN ESKZ 8LVZM CRTD 4W Fey RWA Felthum Barlingming JPG Fey Width 等于1200 As medieval belief systems matured, they began to regulate not only fear and behavior, but imagination itself, narrowing the range of what people believed was even possible. Possibility was not open-ended. It was bounded by tradition, authority, and inherited explanation. People did not imagine futures radically different from their present because the world was believed to be fundamentally fixed, already shaped by divine order and ancient truth. Progress was not expected, only endurance. This made people emotionally skilled at surviving difficulty, but hesitant to envision improvement. Even when life became harsher, it was seen as confirmation rather than contradiction of belief. Hardship meant the system was working, not failing. This circular logic gave myths extraordinary resilience. The worse life became, the more necessary belief felt. Fear deepened faith, and faith justified fear. Over time, this created an emotional equilibrium where constant anxiety felt normal and calm felt suspicious. Peace was temporary, danger was permanent. People learned to live with tension, the way one lives with background noise, rarely noticing it until it stopped. Moments of safety were cherished quietly, never announced, never trusted to last. Celebration was brief, modest, and carefully contained. Excess was feared because it disrupted balance, and balance was believed to be fragile. Even abundance carried moral risk, as too much success could attract punishment or envy from unseen forces. As a result, people learned to downplay fortune and exaggerate humility. Pride was dangerous, not just socially but cosmically. The safest posture was submission, not because people lacked ambition, but because ambition felt unsafe. This belief shaped character across generations, producing endurance, patience, and restraint, but also resignation. People learned to adapt inwardly rather than change outward conditions. Emotional flexibility replaced structural challenge. When injustice appeared, it was endured rather than confronted, explained as fate, trial, or hidden necessity. This did not mean people were unaware of suffering. It meant suffering was expected. Expectation softened shock but hardened inequality. Belief offered meaning but rarely solutions. Yet within this restrictive mental world, people found profound connection. Shared fear created solidarity. Shared rituals created belonging. When everyone feared the same things, they trusted one another more deeply. Isolation was dangerous not only practically but spiritually. Being alone meant being unprotected. Community was a shield against the unknown. This made conformity comforting, even when it was limiting. To believe together was to survive together. Over time, belief became less about conviction and more about participation. One did not need to believe perfectly. One needed to behave correctly. Ritual mattered more than doubt. This allowed myths to persist even as private skepticism slowly grew. People could question silently while acting faithfully, preserving social stability. In this way, medieval myths were flexible enough to survive internal contradiction. They adapted to doubt by absorbing it, reframing uncertainty as mystery rather than error. Mystery itself was sacred. Not knowing was not failure, it was proof of depth. This made ignorance respectable and curiosity risky. Yet this same respect for mystery allowed people to live with unanswered questions without despair. The unknown was frightening, but it was also meaningful. It suggested that reality was larger than human understanding, which brought both fear and comfort. In a world where life was short and danger constant, meaning mattered more than mastery, medieval myths offered meaning generously, even when they misled. They turned chaos into story, suffering into lesson, and fear into structure. They were not simply false beliefs waiting to be corrected, but emotional frameworks designed to keep people functioning in a world that rarely offered mercy. Even today, when uncertainty rises, similar frameworks quietly return, proving that while knowledge evolves, the human response to fear remains remarkably consistent. Image ETPS非 static E Squarespace com 非 static 非50 add 非 RA14B 0CC1 D786569 EB 非 T 非 5C1 Fab 6F352 F53CTF 俄 CB 97 B 非 154 559 57 非 Format 等于 1500W Imaged PS Fed WW English Aku Fei sites Fei default Fei files Fei styles Fei MT Fei image Fei large Fei public Fei English Fei images Fei TA Yitenin RC PX Gen Bayu Fei tapestry Fei Censure Gen Censusen Fei commit Fei Halley Fei Harold JPG Itok Donu QKQPK Fei TWs Imaged PS Fei IETS static com 费2069999非非非 57D1D 20731分之52851非非300叉300点207312851非 HXNB JPG Image ATPS 非 CXEB 减 CDN Net 非 CZ 非 News 非800 A 非2021非 Publication 减-500减 EA-1 JPG Image ATTS 非 Up Wikimedia Org 非 Wikipedia 非 Commons 非 Thumb 非23分之2非 A 非 Battle 非 To 非 Poitiers JPG 非 500 PX 减 the 非 Battle Fey of Fatiers. JPG, as belief continued to shape medieval life. People slowly learned to measure safety not by evidence, but by familiarity. Anything known, repeated, and inherited felt safer than something new. Even if the known was harsh or painful, suffering that followed tradition felt predictable, while change felt like chaos waiting to strike. This is why old customs were defended fiercely, even when they caused harm, because abandoning them felt like removing the last barrier between humanity and disaster. People trusted rituals more than results, repetition more than improvement. A failed ritual could be explained away, but abandoning ritual entirely felt unthinkable. Over time, fear became polite, controlled, and orderly. fitting neatly into daily routines. Panic was rare not because life was safe, but because fear had been normalized. People expected loss, illness, and hardship, and prepared for them emotionally long before they arrived. This anticipation softened shock but hardened hope. Surprise itself. Life was still dangerous, but it followed rules. Even when those rules were imaginary, they offered structure. Over time, people learned to live inside those structures, finding moments of peace within restriction. Joy existed in small, permitted spaces, and love survived within boundaries shaped by belief. The medieval world was not joyless, but joy was cautious, protected, and brief. Belief taught people how to endure rather than how to transform. It trained patience, obedience, and resilience at the cost of curiosity and freedom. Yet without these myths, many might not have endured at all. In a world where death was common and explanations were scarce, belief filled the silence with meaning. It told people that suffering mattered, that fear had purpose, and that chaos followed a hidden order. Medieval myths were not just stories people told, they were the mental architecture of survival. And though modern knowledge has dismantled many of their claims, the human need that created them remains unchanged. Whenever the world feels unpredictable, dangerous, or beyond control, the instinct to seek meaning returns. In that sense, medieval myths are not relics of a distant past, but echoes of a human response that still lives quietly within us today. Existence. Belief became indistinguishable from instinct, shaping reactions before thought could even form. People did not consciously decide to believe, belief had already decided for them. The world was approached cautiously, as if reality itself were fragile and easily angered. Every action carried imagined weight, and even small mistakes felt dangerous, because consequences were believed to ripple far beyond the visible moment. People learned to move through life quietly, carefully, and with constant awareness of invisible judgment. Even moments of rest were guarded, as idleness was believed to invite temptation or interference. Work was not only survival, but protection, a way to remain aligned with order. When alone, many felt more vulnerable than when surrounded by others, because witnesses were believed to deter unseen threats. Loneliness carried spiritual risk. This fear shaped architecture, customs, and daily rhythm, encouraging closeness not just for warmth or labour, but for safety. Shared belief created shared reality, and breaking from it felt like stepping outside the world itself. Over time, imagination became restrained, directed toward familiar fears rather than unknown possibilities. People imagined what they were taught to imagine, feared what they were taught to fear, and trusted what tradition approved. The mind learned to stay within safe boundaries. Even questions were framed carefully, designed not to challenge belief, but to navigate within it. Curiosity survived only when it reinforced existing explanations. When contradictions appeared, they were absorbed into myth rather than exposed. A failed prediction did not disprove belief. It was reinterpreted as misread signs or insufficient faith. This flexibility allowed myths to survive indefinitely, adapting without collapsing. Life became an exercise in interpretation, rather than understanding events mattered less than what they symbolized. This made the world feel alive, responsive, and watching. People felt small but noticed, insignificant yet observed. This paradox created both fear and comfort. Being watched meant being judged, but also being seen. In a harsh world, being seen felt better than being forgotten. Even suffering gained dignity when it was believed to matter. Pain without meaning was unbearable, but pain with purpose could be endured. Medieval myths offered purpose generously, even when it was cruel. They transformed randomness into narrative and chaos into order. Over centuries, this narrative shaped how people remembered the past and imagined the future. History was not progress, but warning. Change was not improvement, but risk. Safety lay in repetition. Yet within this closed world, people loved, laughed, hoped, and dreamed, though always within invisible limits. The myths did not erase humanity. They contained it. They acted like walls around the mind, restrictive yet protective. Modern eyes see those walls as prisons, but medieval minds often experienced them as shelter. In a time when life expectancy was short and danger constant, belief was not luxury but necessity. These myths were not invented to deceive but to survive. They allowed people to wake each day with a sense that the world, however cruel, still followed rules. And in a world ruled by fear, rules, even imagined ones, were better than none. People slowly lost the habit of separating inner fear from outer reality. What they felt emotionally was assumed to be happening externally as well, making anxiety itself a form of evidence. If dread arose without a clear reason, it was not questioned but trusted, because fear was believed to be an instinctive warning sent by higher forces. This made emotions authoritative, turning worry into proof and calm into protection. People learned to monitor their feelings carefully, treating sudden unease as a sign that something unseen was wrong. This emotional vigilance reinforced myths daily, even in the absence of visible danger. The mind became another landscape filled with omens. Thoughts were not private experiences, but moral events with consequences, encouraging constant self-gen correction. Guilt often existed without clear cause, sustained by the belief that wrongdoing could be hidden, even from oneself. This inner tension shaped behavior long before any external authority intervened. People punished themselves through fasting, silence, or denial of comfort, believing self-gen discipline could prevent future disaster. Over time, hardship felt safer than ease, because comfort was believed to invite vulnerability. A difficult life felt honest, while ease felt suspicious. This mindset trained people to expect loss rather than growth, and survival rather than fulfillment. Even happiness carried an edge of fear, as joy was believed to attract envy from unseen forces or provoke balance then restoring tragedy. As a result, people often moderated their emotions, refusing to celebrate fully or grieve too deeply. Balance mattered more than intensity. The safest emotional state was neutrality. Social bonds were shaped by this caution, with trust built slowly and broken easily. A single rumor, dream, or coincidence could undo years of familiarity. Reputation was fragile because myth gave imagination more power than evidence. Once suspicion entered, it rarely left. Communities relied on conformity, not because it was comforting, but because difference felt dangerous. Standing out risked attention, and attention invited judgment. This fear preserved social order while quietly suffocating individuality. Yet within this system, people found ways to cope. Shared rituals created moments of collective relief, allowing fear to be released briefly before returning. Festivals offered structured joy, carefully contained within acceptable boundaries. Laughter was allowed, but only at the right time, in the right place, and for the right reason. This made joy precious but fleeting. Over generations, people learned how to live with constant uncertainty, without breaking, developing emotional endurance that modern life rarely demands. Medieval myths acted as psychological tools, organizing fear so it did not overwhelm. They explained why suffering happened when it would end, and how it could be endured. Even false explanations were better than none. In a world where life could end suddenly and violently, meaning was a form of protection. These beliefs did not eliminate pain, but they gave it shape, making it survivable. When viewed through this lens, medieval myths were not simply errors waiting to be corrected, but emotional structures that allowed people to function in an unforgiving world. They reveal how deeply humans need explanation, order, and reassurance when faced with constant danger. Though centuries have passed, the instinct remains the same. Whenever certainty disappears, the mind reaches for meaning, and when knowledge feels insufficient, belief steps in to fill the silence. Interpretation. Even the passage of time carried emotional weight, as days were not simply measured but judged. Certain moments were believed to be safer than others, and people adjusted their lives accordingly, rising, working, resting, and praying in rhythms shaped by fear as much as faith. Morning was welcomed as protection, while night was endured rather than enjoyed, tolerated only because it could not be avoided. Sleep itself was risky, as dreams were believed to open the mind to outside influence, making bedtime rituals essential for spiritual defense. People whispered prayers not for peace, but for protection, hoping to wake unchanged. Waking alive was quietly celebrated. Even if never spoken aloud, this emotional caution influenced how people loved, trusted, and formed bonds. Attachment was tempered by the expectation of loss, because death was always close and rarely gentle. Hope was trained to look beyond the present, settling into the promise of later reward rather than immediate improvement. The future was imagined not as progress, but as repetition, a continuation of struggle under the same unseen rules. This made patience a necessary skill, taught early and practiced constantly. Children learned restraint before curiosity, obedience before exploration, and caution before confidence. Stories were chosen carefully, often frightening by design, because fear was considered educational. A frightened child was a prepared child. Over time, imagination itself became disciplined, guided toward accepted fears rather than personal wonder. Creativity survived, but often disguised as tradition, symbol, or religious expression. Art did not question reality. It reinforced it, illustrating the invisible threats people already believed surrounded them. These images shaped memory, making fear visual and therefore more convincing. Language itself absorbed myth, as common expressions carried assumptions about fate, luck, and divine will. Words like fortune, doom, blessing, and curse were not metaphors, but literal forces in everyday thought. This made speech careful and intentional, as careless language was believed to shape reality. Silence again felt safer. Even laughter was measured, enjoyed briefly and quietly, as excess emotion was thought to disturb balance. Communities valued predictability over happiness, stability over joy. When disaster struck, as it inevitably did, grief was shared but rarely questioned. Asking why tragedy happened was acceptable only within the boundaries of belief. Practical explanations felt insufficient, even disrespectful. Meaning mattered more than accuracy. Over centuries, this mindset created endurance but limited transformation. People survived but rarely imagined a world fundamentally different from their own. Yet within this constrained imagination was remarkable strength. Medieval people endured famine, plague, war, and loss with a resilience shaped by belief. Myths gave shape to fear and direction to suffering, preventing despair from becoming chaos. Though modern knowledge has replaced many explanations, the emotional habits formed in that era still echo today. Humans continue to search for signs in uncertainty, patterns in chaos, and meaning in pain. Medieval myths remind us that belief is not always about knowing the world correctly, but about surviving it long enough to face tomorrow. First core. The medieval belief system trained people to live in a state of permanent alertness, where certainty was rare and vigilance was constant. The world was not trusted to behave predictably, and stability was seen as temporary, fragile, and easily broken by unseen influence. People learned to read meaning into everything, because ignoring signs felt reckless, even dangerous. A sudden silence in nature, an animal behaving strangely, or an unexplained noise could shift an entire household into fear. These moments were not dismissed, they were discussed, remembered, and woven into shared understanding. Memory itself became selective, preserving events that seemed to confirm belief, while quietly forgetting those that did not. Over time, this created a self-reinforcing loop, where myth felt increasingly proven simply because it was always expected. Even when nothing happened, the absence of disaster was taken as evidence that rituals had worked. Survival became proof of belief. People rarely felt fully safe, only temporarily protected, which made constant effort feel necessary just to maintain balance. This belief turned daily life into quiet labor against invisible threat, exhausting yet familiar. Many learned to find comfort in repetition because repetition suggested control. The same prayers, gestures, and routines were performed not out of devotion alone, but because change felt risky. The unknown was not exciting, it was terrifying. Curiosity was restrained not by lack of intelligence, but by fear of consequence. Questioning tradition felt like removing armor in a hostile world. Even progress, when it appeared, was often disguised as continuity to avoid suspicion. New ideas survived only when they could be framed as rediscovered truths rather than inventions. Over generations, this taught societies how to adapt slowly without appearing to change. Emotionally, this world produced endurance more than happiness. Joy existed, but it was cautious, often private and quickly moderated. Grief, however, was expected and structured, given form through ritual, so it could be managed rather than overwhelming. Fear became a shared language that bonded communities together, creating unity through common anxiety. People trusted those who feared the same things, and distrusted those who did not. This made belief a social contract rather than a personal choice. To belong was to believe, or at least to behave as though one did. Even doubt was shaped by belief, as people questioned themselves rather than the system. When suffering came, as it often did, myth softened its edge by offering explanation. A meaningless tragedy was harder to bear than a painful lesson, meaning even when frightening gave suffering shape. In this way, medieval myths acted as emotional survival tools rather than intellectual errors. They reduced chaos into patterns the mind could hold, even if those patterns were false. The modern world may reject their conclusions, but the impulse behind them remains unchanged. Whenever uncertainty rises, humans still search for signs, causes, and hidden order. Medieval myths remind us that belief is not always about truth, but about endurance, and that for centuries, these stories were not entertainment or ignorance, but the very framework that allowed people to wake up each day and face a world that felt endlessly dangerous, so completely that separating truth from myth was not only difficult, but unnecessary in the minds of the people living. Then life was experienced through interpretation rather than analysis, and understanding the world meant decoding signs rather than testing causes. A sudden illness was not just sickness, but a message, a warning, or a consequence, and responding correctly mattered more than curing it. People learned to live cautiously within this interpretive framework, adjusting behavior constantly to remain in harmony with forces they could not see or control. Even silence had layers of meaning, as saying nothing was sometimes safer than risking the wrong words. Everyday actions were slowed by ritual, not because people enjoyed ceremony, but because skipping it felt dangerous. Habit became armor. Over time, fear softened into normalcy, and what once terrified ancestors became routine to descendants. Children inherited fear before understanding, absorbing anxiety as instinct rather than knowledge. A creaking sound at night, a strange dream, or an unexpected visitor could trigger deep unease, not because of evidence, but because stories had taught what such moments. Fem fae, the past weighed heavily on the present, as tradition was trusted more than observation, and the authority of the dead outweighed the curiosity of the living. People believed the world had already revealed all its truths, and that innovation risked angering powers that preferred order over change. This belief slowed progress, but created stability, even if that stability was built on fear. Hope existed, but it was cautious, controlled, and often delayed to the afterlife, rather than invested in the present. Suffering was tolerated because it was explained, and explanation made pain survivable. When myths contradicted experience, experience was questioned, not belief. Over centuries, this trained the mind to accept rather than challenge, to endure rather than resist. Yet within this system was a quiet resilience, a way of surviving constant uncertainty without collapsing into despair. Medieval myths acted as emotional scaffolding, holding people upright in a world filled with famine, disease, violence, and loss. They did not need to be accurate to be effective. They needed only to be shared. In that shared belief, people found belonging, meaning, and a sense that chaos followed rules, even if those rules were unseen. Studying these beliefs today reveals not a foolish past, but a human response to fear that remains deeply familiar. The medieval world reminds us that when answers are scarce, myths grow strong, and when life feels fragile, belief becomes shelter. PNG in the final layers of medieval belief. Myths became so internalized that people no longer recognized them as beliefs at all, but as the natural order of existence. Fear was not always loud or dramatic. Often it was quiet, habitual, woven into daily routine so deeply that it felt invisible. People avoided certain paths, words, gestures, and even thoughts without consciously remembering why, trusting instinct shaped by generations of warning. This created a world where caution felt like wisdom and obedience felt like safety. Even kindness was filtered through myth, as helping the wrong person could invite spiritual danger, and charity was sometimes offered out of fear rather than empathy. People believed that excessive confidence tempted fate, So humility became a survival strategy rather than a moral choice. Success was downplayed, joy restrained, and ambition softened to avoid attracting unseen punishment. Many lived with a constant sense of being watched, not only by authorities or neighbours, but by invisible forces recording every action. Privacy as a concept barely existed because thoughts themselves were believed to matter as much as actions. This internal surveillance shaped personalities, encouraging restraint, guilt, and self-gen correction. Long before punishment was needed, silence became a virtue. Not because it was peaceful, but because words were dangerous. A careless statement could be misunderstood, twisted into rumour, or interpreted as spiritual rebellion. Fear of accusation was often stronger than fear of truth, making conformity the safest choice. Time reinforced these patterns as repetition transformed fear into instinct and myth into habit. Even when people doubted privately, they often behaved publicly as believers, reinforcing the system they quietly questioned. Over centuries, this created a society where beliefs survived, not through conviction alone, but through routine. Myths no longer needed to be taught explicitly. They were absorbed simply by living within the culture. The boundary between faith, superstition, and fear dissolved entirely, creating a worldview where emotional safety mattered more than factual accuracy. When disaster struck, people did not ask how to prevent it next time, but how to interpret it correctly. Meaning mattered more than solution. This focus on interpretation over prevention slowed progress, but strengthened emotional resilience. Endurance became a skill passed down like inheritance. Even despair was structured, given form and explanation, making it easier to bear. Medieval myths endured because they answered emotional needs that knowledge alone could not satisfy. They offered certainty when life was fragile, order when chaos threatened, and purpose when suffering felt unbearable. Though many of these beliefs have vanished, their emotional architecture remains recognizable today. Humans still seek patterns in randomness, meaning in pain and comfort in ritual. The medieval world reminds us that myths are not just false stories, but tools the human mind creates to survive uncertainty. In that sense, medieval myths were not simply mistakes of history, but mirrors of humanity's deepest fears, and its relentless desire to feel safe in a world it could not yet understand.